Swim Things in Blue Springs, your one-stop shop for all things swim. Pools, spas, patio furniture, swimwear, and accessories. Visit them in Blue Springs or at www.swimthings.com.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think part of that is a tribute to the culture of sports then versus now, where now there's such a push for athletes at younger and younger ages to like choose one, do that sport and train for it 11 to 12 months a year. And if you're not doing this and the extra lessons and blah, 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 well, then you're behind.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Journey. We're so excited that you're here. Our guest today is Dr. Megan Cannon, a licensed sport and performance psychologist whose mission is assisting athletes in reaching their peak potential on and off the field. Let's welcome Dr. Megan Cannon to the show. How are you today?
Hi, I am doing better than I deserve. How are you guys doing?
Good.
I'm doing very well. What does that mean, doing better than I deserve?
Just doing so well. And as humans, we always are not flawless individuals, and so I am doing better than I deserve. So it's a great day. It's a Monday. It's sunny here. I'm based in Pennsylvania, and so the weather is good as much as it can be for fall, and so it's a great way to kick off the week. And excited to be here with you guys and appreciate that you invited me on to join.
We're happy to have you. So sports psychology is a very important field right now in 2020, especially because athletes are really struggling to cope with the effects that the coronavirus pandemic are having on their athletic careers. So, how does sports psychology differ from what I guess would be normal psychology?
Right. And so my background, I have my PhD in clinical psychology, and then I specialize with athletes, not only clinically, but then also with sport performance. At my grad school, I had the opportunity to really be exposed to sports psychology for the first time. And what makes it really unique, especially those of us that are clinical sports psychologists versus people that just have like sport performance degrees, is that as you all know, athletics, just because you're an athlete does not mean that other areas of your life are not around. So if I'm having a really tough time with my family or with school or a pandemic, I can't necessarily just completely shut myself off from that emotionally, mentally, when then it's my time to go to practice or perform in some capacity. And so with what I do is I have the opportunity to work with athletes exclusively and helping them not only navigate and improve performance aspects in the water or whatever other sport that they are engaged in, but also have the opportunity to help them address the other elements of life, their emotional health overall. And being that I work exclusively with athletes, with athletic departments, I'm more familiar and versed just in the stressors that are very unique to athletes, from performing, managing, like being a part of a team, failure, coaches, that dynamic, recruiting, all of those different things, similar to maybe like a child psychologist who they only work with kids and are much more familiar and can speak to that, versus someone that works with older adults that are more familiar with those stressors. And so as a sports psychologist, I kind of compare it to, like, we have the opportunity, the athletes that I work with, to kind of start the race a little bit more ahead, since that's kind of the world I live in. It's the world that they live in. And so we can kind of pick up in having that conversation without them having to explain to me a lot of those stressors that are really unique for athletes, student athletes, just being that that's the world I operate in all the time and
What
used
are
to live
some
in.
of the challenges that athletes have been bringing to you during this quarantine and COVID season?
I think one of the biggest ones, which is like society wide, but then in athletics, is like, when are we going to compete again? A lot of athletes that I work with are still training. Some of them more or less than others, in terms of some people have access to pools and their teams are kind of business as usual, versus others, it's a little bit less so. So the big question mark is when am I going to be able to perform again? What is my season going to look like? A lot of the unknowns about that, not only between when's it going to start, are we going to have a season this year? And if so, what's that even going to look like? Are we doing virtual meets? Are we going to have people there being able to watch it? So there's just so many unknowns that I hear about a lot that I think are really starting to impact a lot of people, since they continue to just be unknowns. It's this very open-ended situation, and anxiety is fear of the unknown. And as humans, we don't really sit with those unknowns super well, and our brain has a really great talent of filling in some negatives or negative outcomes with it, which then create some more stressful experience. And so a lot of the things I've been hearing a lot about are, all of those unknowns, in addition to them navigating whatever their back to school, at a university or a high school, whatever that looks like, because either you're online or a hybrid or, whatever it is, but it looks a lot different no matter, what the situation is. So that's a lot of what I've been talking with the athletes about more recently.
How did you settle on sports psychology when there's so many different fields of psychology?
It's a great question. So I was an athlete all growing up. I swam, I played softball, I also danced. And so when I retired from all of that, I just sort of assumed that my time in the sports world was done. Um, in college, I found that psychology for me was a really good fit, but I guess public service announcement for anybody that's a psychology major or thinking about it, there's really not much you can do with a bachelor's in psychology. You really have to continue on if that's the direction you want to go. And so I was fortunate enough to get into a graduate school program that just happened to have a sports psychologist on staff. And they also had a sports psychology program that, as a fourth year doctoral student, I was able to apply and got accepted to that particular clinical rotation. And it's like, before I went to grad school, I didn't even know that sports psychology existed. It's still, this was years ago, so it was not something we heard about at all, really. And so it was at that time that it was this fusion of that sports world that I thought I was kind of removed from at that point, and the psychology world that I had more recently been in. And it was just a really good match for me. It was a population I really enjoyed working with. People are generally a little bit younger, between their high school, college, or even a little bit after college. And so I have the opportunity to really teach young adults these skills that are really applicable and help them in their sport life at that moment in time. That ultimately, beyond their own personal retirement from sports, it's going to be skills that they can use and transition and transfer to other areas. And so for me, I loved the immediate population, but then also the opportunity to really just help people learn skills that can help them just in general.
What about psychology itself that appeals to you as a field of study?
It's the study of people, basically. And so one back is a little bit like maybe indicative of how I got here. But it's the study of people. And we teach basic math as we go through life, but we don't teach people basic emotion. And so emotions are things that we have. We're not getting rid of them. And so the field of psychology is just so cool, because we're able, the tools that we have and we use are the tools that we use every day to interact with people. And so for me, that was just really cool, of not only being able to really help people, but to provide them and study and learn these things that help just the human experience, and us, getting that chance to human, be a little bit easier.
And what challenges did you meet in your own athletic career that informed your psychology studies?
I think now, in looking back at it, we did not talk about like any of these things at that point in time. We never, I don't remember ever really learning about mental or emotional health at all. But upon looking back, I can see that I was definitely really anxious, and it made it not fun. I was so afraid to mess up or to not do well or perform well or make a mistake, and so I like that mindset piece of it. In looking back, really, I think took this thing that when I was little was super fun. And then over time, upper levels that you get to it, it becomes like, okay, well, I have to do well and much more stressful, and the fun just got sucked out of it. And so in looking back, I'm like, wow, like I wish I knew some of these things, not only in helping to manage that experience of anxiety, but also just my mindset and how important it was, and different tools to help me readjust it or realign it would have been so much more helpful. And I truthfully think it would have also encouraged me to elongate my career rather than like, nope, like I'm done. This is not even fun anymore.
Yeah, it's so amazing to think that in the scheme of things, sports psychology is really very new to trying to help athletes through all this. Like you said, I mean, a lot of athletes 10, 15, 20 years ago would have really, I think, prospered a lot better in any sport if this were a field that a lot of people really thought was very viable beyond just, an athlete's not doing well, just talk to a psychologist about how you're feeling, and not trying to, lump it into sports and try to get the answers through all of that together. So yeah, I really can understand that. And speaking about your own swimming career, I'd love to talk about it, but we can't talk about it without mentioning all the other extracurricular activities you did. I mean, you talked about dance and softball and swimming. I mean, that's so much. And then you had school too. How were you able to balance all those priorities and still do well as an athlete and as a dancer and as a student?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think part of that is a tribute to the culture of sports then versus now, where now there's such a push for athletes at younger and younger ages to like choose one, do that sport, and train for it 11 to 12 months a year. And if you're not doing this and the extra lessons and blah, 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 well, then you're behind. When I was growing up, it was okay, like we train, here's the season. Yes, you do club in the off season, but it just wasn't, there wasn't as much of this like high intensity pressure culture as there is now, which I believe really helped me, balance that. And I loved having those different times of the year where I knew, fall, summer, fall, winter was more swimming, and then as the winter ended, spring and then summer was more softball. And so as I was getting sick of one, I would get to do the other. Dance was pretty much like a August to May thing, so there was definitely overlap, but it enabled me to have kind of organic breaks in some of the other things, or in each of them individually. So then when it was towards the end of the season and it was like, ugh, okay, like I'm over this, I just do not want to smell like chlorine anymore, I got a break. And then I was away from it for, 2 to 3 months. And then it was like, oh my gosh, yes, I missed this. And so I think the culture of sports back then in like the early 2000s was a lot different than it is now, which helped facilitate that. And in looking back at it, it was great. And it really challenged, or enabled rather, that love for the sport to continue rather than just burnout, because I was doing the same thing every day. But then also, in every athlete has slumps, you hit plateaus, there's things that just happen as a part of that experience. And so if I was having like a slump in swimming, but then was able to have a softball workout and did really well, it was like, okay, whew, like even though swimming's not going well, at least I'm good at this other thing. And so just in terms of identity development and confidence was really helpful, having these multiple puzzle pieces. And so although there were nights that I was, up doing homework until 11 or 12 at night, which I don't think is, that has not gone away, but that it was really helpful in just kind of balancing things out throughout the sport year.
Were you ever pressured to just pick one and do it year round?
My parents were awesome in not doing that, and also the coaches I had, they did not do that. I mean, there were definitely times where seasons overlapped. I remember one particular year I was at states for swimming and the softball season had already started, and the coaches didn't love that. But like, what are you gonna, you can't penalize an athlete for having success in one sport disabling them to get to yours, and so so some of like those conversations had to happen of, I'm not just skipping for fun, I still have to go to swim, because I got this opportunity or earned this opportunity. So there were some tensions, but I never had a coach tell me, and I'm so thankful for that, because some of the athletes I work with now, their coaches tell them that of like, well, you have to choose, or if you're going to these other workouts or you're doing this, and it's, that particular season's off season, even though it's another sport's in season, and they get slack for it. I hear the athletes behind closed doors, and it really stresses them out, and it's just not a great formula.
Right. So, regards to swimming in Pennsylvania, it's really good. It's a very good swimming state. We've had Olympians come out of it, a lot of great names in the sport. When you were at Town Central Catholic High School, your team won the district championship team title 4 years in a row, which is definitely not an easy thing to do. What was the pressure like to repeat as champions every year?
It was such a unique experience because our team didn't even have a pool. And so it was like we were those like kind of underdog kids that's like, we don't have a pool. We never had home meets. We always had to travel. But the pressure, I think, was probably more self-imposed. We had a coach change, I think my sophomore to junior year. And so it wasn't even the coach being like, we have to do this. It was more us and the class of girls that I had the opportunity to swim with were really motivated. We overall got along really well, which facilitated us wanting to go to practice. Like that energy and culture in the locker room was always a really fun one, along with the bus rides and those things that, we might not think are like as important to swimming fast, but they really are, in terms of we wanted to be there. We enjoyed it. Like we had the pride of like, okay, we're coming back as district champs. We're earning that again next year. And so, so from the coaches, there wasn't too much of that. From us individually, we probably added it on a little bit more, but because it was such a fun culture, we got along. The school itself was pretty small, so you kind of knew everyone. That really helped in that process of success.
What events did you swim?
I was a sprint freestyler, did a 50 and 100 frees, and then we're a part of relays. I got plopped in, a 5 free at points in time and 2 frees, but the 50 and 100 free were definitely the bread and butter for me.
So when it came time to start college for you, how did you decide to hang up your swimsuit and pursue dance as you also went with your psychology degree?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just over it. I don't know any other like way to describe it besides I did not want to do it anymore. I think there could, some of that anxiety and that pressure of just like, oh my goodness, having to perform well while looking ahead at college and just, ugh. And for me, dance was the more fun thing. I enjoyed it so much more. And so when it sort of came time to start choosing and selecting, all right, in this transition to college, what are the things you want to take with you? What are some of the things that you want to, intentionally bow out of? The thing that brought me the most joy, the thing I liked the most really was dance. And so it enabled that decision, although a tough one. And I think my parents were kind of bummed about it, but going to practices every day and going through the motions of it. And so although, they did certain colleges, like we went and looked at the pool and met with the coach and stuff, I just, for me, if I was the one boots on the ground every day, and I think that that's an important thing for all athlete parents to think about, is it's the student that's going to be, or the athlete that's going to have to be doing and going through the motions every day. And for me, the dance piece of it was so much more fun. I enjoyed it a lot more. And so although it was not the easiest transition out of athletics, it for me just worked. And that like the retirement process was pretty good. And it enabled me to then really appreciate those last swim meets, the last practices, because I was choosing to go out on my own terms. I didn't like have this forced, oh, you have to at least try swimming in college for a little bit. My parents were like, okay, if you want to choose that direction, great. And I actually wound up going to a college that didn't even have a swim team. I like nipped it in the butt right away. Softball, my dad was like, are you sure you don't want to just maybe like do a walk-on situation? And I was like, nope, I'm good.
So after getting your bachelor's degree in psychology and then your PhD in clinical psychology, how easy was it to find employment?
So I was really fortunate. I was out doing my pre and postdoc internships out in California, but knew that the sports psychology situation was one I wanted to get back into. And so at the time, universities really didn't have it. There were a handful, like that I can think of that had sports psychology positions, but I fortunately had learned of a group practice that was in Pennsylvania around the area I grew up in that was clinical sports psychologists. They only would take on people that had the clinical degree plus the sport performance competency area, because that mental and emotional health sport performance is sometimes really tough to separate. And so I had applied to join that practice, and it worked out really well. So I made the move back east to join that practice. And then it was 2 years ago, this past August, I then went independent and am now my own entity. And so now, in terms of that transition of finding the job, that was, I think, just it might have been less challenging than for others, just, because of these kind of organic opportunities that came up. I'm also like Christian. And so I have this faith-based thing. And it was like, it just felt like the right thing to do, even though Pennsylvania has way less better weather than California did. But it was just those things where it's like, hey, this is where you're kind of needing to go right now. And so I just trusted it and went with it. Now I'm always on Indeed, just kind of keeping tabs on the things that are out there. I do see more frequently and increasingly so each year opportunities at NCAA institutions that are for sports psychologists, again, primarily from the mental health perspective, licensed sports psychologists. And so that's increasing. Who knows, like, kind of what's going to happen with funding right now in athletic departments with the pandemic. But I think that the opportunities in the sports psychology world are slowly increasing. There's definitely more opportunities out there now than there were 5-10 years ago.
So as a successful doctor in sports psychology, as well as being a woman, is there any challenge of getting the respect you deserve?
Oh, that's a great question. I remember I actually had someone tell me, don't even bother reaching out to football programs because they do not want girls in their locker room. I was like, okay. Well, I shot the email out anyway, but there's definitely sometimes different comments of like, oh, you look so young, or like in some of like just different, I definitely get some comments sometimes. And I'm also only 5'2". So I don't think that that my lack of a billowing physical presence is not super helpful either. But I definitely get some comments. People will call me Megan a lot, even though it's like, okay, went to school for a really long time. But, so there's little things like that. Something that I try to do to combat that is I lift. And so I know that if I'm this like kind of short girl in a 6 foot plus world that's pretty male dominant, if I can at least like show up like and feel that internal confidence of like, hey man, I just deadlifted like 270 this morning, so let's do this, so that for me is helpful in navigating that. But there's definitely some things some comments I've got along the way where I'm just like, I am gonna choose to see beyond this comment and just keep doing my thing. But also then being a female in the sports world has definitely opened up a lot of cool opportunities that are fostered really towards developing teenage female athletes. And so on that regard, it's, although some of the comments are there of like, oh, football players, like the locker, they're not going to have anything to do with you, which, who knows if that's true or not. I don't think it is. It's not been in my experience directly, but, it's definitely opened up the doors for some other opportunities that have been really, really exciting.
So how did you become the go-to person to be on ESPN to offer your knowledge about sports psychology?
It's such like a 2000s answer, LinkedIn. Their producers were looking for something, and I was, popping out just these videos, and one of their producers was just looking for a different angle on one of their stories about it was a couple years ago, where Kyle Lowry, one of the athletes in the NBA finals, like took a break and went back to the locker room like 2 minutes before halftime, and they were kind of trying to just get a different perspective as to why, or someone on it. And so I had content out there and they had reached out. And so then after that, I think I was in there. Some of the producers then had my name and contact information. So, 2 other times they had reached out on different stories. And so it was fun and exciting. But yeah, it was just putting content out there and having those social profiles, which, I think that they're really preaching a lot probably to college graduates and stuff like that.
Yeah, I guess the motto, the thing about that is just be connected. You never
Right?
know what's going to happen from it.
You never know what phone call I remember I talked to my dad. I was like, there's somebody calling me from ESPN in Connecticut. Like, and he was like, that's where they're based. Like, yes, that's a real person calling you, not just, you can never know when some like rogue phone number is calling you. But yeah, so it was a pretty cool experience.
And now you're even branching out more with this weekly podcast called The Mind Game. I mean, it must be gratifying to live in this time where you can share your knowledge with the sports community across this kind of platform.
Yeah. And so that podcast is not like mine specifically. I've popped on as guests in different podcasts. What I try to do is, on Instagram, put videos out there, because I think one thing that's really challenging in sports psychology is athletes are learning more about it. But in addition to like, what do you do? The follow-up question is a lot of times like, well, how do I even start? Or where do I even start? Or what are good books to read? Or what are things to do that I can learn more about this? And so my goal in putting these weekly videos out is just to give people a place to start, and to give people some things to think about. They're like anywhere from 2 to 4 minutes, it's not super long things, but it's at least somewhere to start getting a basis, a foundation of it, to get the wheels turning a little bit of things to think about as they're then approaching sport. And so I think, with having all these different social forums and opportunities, it's really a great way just for athletes that are interested in where do I start. There's a lot of options out there, which is really cool.
Yeah. So going back to, dealing with the pandemic, and you actually also mentioned that every athlete goes through that plateau in their lives and their athletic performance. Obviously, there's no one perfect answer that can help everybody, but how would you guide a struggling athlete through through that mental struggle of breaking through that plateau?
Yeah, it's tough and it happens. I think a couple of things come to mind. First and foremost, really trying to foster that growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Just because you're plateauing now, like just because you haven't reached that time or broken through, you just haven't done it yet. Doesn't mean you're never going to do it. And so when we foster that growth mindset of, hey, with practice, with trying to focus on certain things and get better with time, like it will happen. Because happens a lot of times we get stuck in that plateau, and then next time you're up on the blocks, it's like, all right, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. And then you just wind up stressing yourself out. And then your body is so much in a different condition physically and mentally, than you are at practice. And so it's going to get yourself a little bit further away from that a fair amount of times. And so really being aware of where your head is at, that mindset is really important. But to help break through plateaus, intentional practice is something that is really influential in that. Where I know and it's just like your brain goes somewhere else because you're just staring at a black line for 2 hours, and it's really easy for mentally to go into other places. But in a plateau or even a non-plateau situation, intentionally going into practice, choosing one or two things to work on. Of, hey, today I'm really focusing on my turns and I am focusing on my underwaters. Like that is what I am doing. And so rather than mentally checking out as you're checking in the water, it's every time you're hitting the wall, you are focusing on that form, you're focusing on that turn, you're focusing on that underwater. And through choosing, one or two things, and I'll tell my athletes, choose one or two to intentionally practice for a week, 2 weeks. And then after that week or 2 weeks, choose something else. But rather than focusing on, I have to fix all of these different things, which is overwhelming, and then you're probably not totally focusing on getting much better at any one thing, digging a bunch of little holes rather than like a really pointed one. It's choosing that one or two things and very intentionally focusing on it at practice. And, again, you can choose a different thing every other week or whatever that particular athlete would choose to do with it and what they wanted to do. But then if I'm doing that, not only is that enabling me to intentionally practice and focus on certain things, but then next time I am in a competition setting or a meet situation, in addition to time, that outcome that we, for swimming is very black and white. Now I have these other measures of success where, okay, did I get this time or not get this time? But also, did I get as many underwater kicks as I've been practicing? Did I really like execute that turn well? Like now you're setting up these different measures of success to help you see your progress in addition to, whether or not that time is happening at that meet. It's not that it's never going to happen, it just hasn't happened yet. And through these other things and focusing on some of those more process oriented things in the water can help you build that confidence, can definitely see other measures of success while you're on that pathway of breaking through.
In addition to swimmers, what other athletes do you work with regularly?
In Pennsylvania, we're also a really big wrestling state. And so I work with a lot of wrestlers. I work with a lot of softball players because that was also a area of mine. I've also had the opportunity to work with gymnasts, some ice skaters, baseball players, football players, basketball players. So there's a variety of sports, which is, it's really cool. And, in a sport like gymnastics or ice skating, something that I had no experience doing, it's really cool and really fun to get the opportunity to learn from those athletes. Lacrosse, another one too, that really wasn't super popular in my area growing up. And so I get to learn about these different sports and they get to teach me, which I think is really, I enjoy it. I think they, like the athletes I work with, it's a great way for us to build that relationship because even though I'm, sports psychologist on this side, like I don't know everything. And so, they have the opportunity to teach me a lot as well.
Do you get in the pool often?
I do sometimes. At the one gym I belong to, they have a pool, and so sometimes I will go and do a little bit. And so it's always fun. It never ceases to amaze me how hard swimming is. Because I remember back and like, oh my gosh, I used to be able to like crush these types of sets, and now I get done with the 200, and I'm like, whew, oh my gosh, like it's so hard, and it is that sport that I've had college athletes that in other sports that their team will do swim workouts on the off season, and they have strategically tried to schedule classes for those times because they're like, it's so hard, I just can't do it. And so I do enjoy getting back. It's the feel of the water. There's quite literally nothing like it. So it's a great place to go back to, even though it's also very humbling of like, you think you're in shape until you go have a swim workout and then it's a totally different ballgame.
How did you get into the Spartan races?
They, it was a thing that my brother and I kind of fell into. So sibling bonding, but also a little bit of, it's just a fun challenge. And something that I really try to do, I started doing them before I was like, was actively working in sports psychology, but continued to do them after that because they are things that you never know what obstacles you're going to get. You don't know, like the distances, the terrain are all different. And so I always try to do things to emulate what my athletes are going through, or the athletes that I work with are going through, of these unknowns, of being stressed, of having this pre-race or competition preparation. And so I did Spartans for a while as a way to do that. And also it was just a cool thing my brother and I did together. And then I started doing Ragnars for the same reason. I was like, all right, Spartans, like I've done this, let me try something else. And then after I've done a few of those, I did a CrossFit competition. This year, there was really nothing open. So I learned golf as a way to just try to like, put myself in those situations of being coached, learning something new, having to tolerate mistakes, and so I always am looking for things to do to just help me stay in that mindset and really connect with the athletes I work with in that way. Next year I'm going to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. So this is like a whole new ballpark of stress and unknowns. But yeah, it's, it kind of started out as a hobby with my brother, but then really became a tool that I started to use for work of, if I'm going to work with athletes and talk to them about these skills and teach them, like shame on me, if I wouldn't be doing them or applying them myself. And so that's why they have continued.
It's kind of that saying, physician, heal thyself. I mean, if you don't apply what you're telling others to do, I think you don't really understand it yourself.
Yeah, and it's so easy to forget what it's like to stink at something, you know what I mean? Or like to learn something new, be coached, like getting over mistakes, like all of those different things. It's, you know, it's easy to talk about, but it's really tough to do. And so unless we're challenging ourselves constantly to kind of put ourselves in those positions, we can forget.
Yeah, and I would imagine it continues to challenge you. I mean, in the athletic ways, because it's like it's hard to just step away from that athletic endeavor totally. I mean, I think you're always going to be an athlete. And of course, if you're going to be talking to athletes every day, I'm sure in your mind, you're like, I need to stay active myself.
Totally, totally, 100%.
Well, it has been so great to talk to you, Dr. Megan, and really understand a lot of your insights into how athletes can better themselves. And I really want to encourage everybody to go to Dr. Megan's Instagram. It's Dr. Megan Cannon, Dr. Megan Cannon, and she has a lot of great videos there. Check out all of her appearances on podcasts. They are really insightful. They've helped me in my own athletic endeavors, and kind of like you said, you find that motivation when it's sometimes hard to find, and just to hear it from someone else, it can be very helpful. So thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for joining us today.
But thank you so much for having me on. This was a really fun conversation. I enjoyed your questions, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk with you guys.
Absolutely. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And as we always say, it's not just about the destination, it's also about the journey. We'll see you next time.